Youth of Zimbabwe. I have in studio with me Mr. Sifiso Tso from the NYDA. Mr. Mtsweni, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us.
Look, Sifiso, we've seen the reports of a peaceful vote that has taken place today. What are your sentiments about the vote today?
Well, I think it's quite encouraging.
Yeah.
Indeed, Zimbabwe has turned a corner. Of course, how the current administration would have come into power would have been a discussion for another day. But
many questions,
I think what is important is that we now have an election period that was characterized by robust, campaigning. Mm-hmm. It was characterized by, robust engagements amongst the many parties. Mm-hmm. Unlike before, we did not see any election violence. We did not see too much of the army being involved in these particular elections. We did not see the police being used, to suppress whether opposition and whatever. So, indeed, it's a new corner that Zimbabwe is turning, and I think that as young people of South Africa, it's quite encouraging because we have our compatriots in Zimbabwe, our young comrades there. Yes. There's been a lot of young people who are students in our country who have gladly gone back, to Zimbabwe to cast their votes. So quite encouraging since.
Sifiso, I actually asked our reporter, Griselda Lewis, during a crossing around 3 o'clock this afternoon, and I asked her what type of demographic she was witnessing at the polling station in those queues. And she told me it's quite mixed, and I was expecting for her to say, I'm witnessing more youth because there has been wide calls that Zimbabwe indeed actually needs younger leaders in the face of Nelson Chamisa, who's just 40 years old. But talk to us about the fact that they didn't turn out in their numbers to go and support this cause for change.
Well, you'd remember that the climate throughout the many years was not necessarily conducive for young people. Yeah. And it could never be an overnight thing. The mere fact that the young people are there is a good sign. And I think one of the things which is a broader discussion that we need to have about the continent is the need for younger people to play a more prominent role in the affairs of our different countries. I mean, we just witnessed an over 90-year-old president coming out of office. And if you look at the makeup of the people who are contesting for power, currently even the president of the ruling ZANU-PF
he's 70 years old.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then you look at even the female candidates that are involved. Yeah. So that's why you would actually say that, Nelson Chamisa himself being 40 years old is quite encouraging. But I think moving forward, we need to see in the political parties, in the municipal systems and the local government systems, young people playing a more prominent role in ensuring that the politics of Zimbabwe become renewed and young people become excited again.
Sifiso, when you talk about that, I mean, you did just mention that it wasn't favorable political conditions for the youth to get so involved in politics. I mean, we heard about threats and death threats, or people were getting kidnapped if they stood against the ruling regime. It's no secret that Zimbabweans are very educated individuals. But why have the youth stayed so far away from the forefront of trying to enforce the change and the policies of the previous regime? Because they could have done that. We've seen that in South Africa happening.
Well, you'd remember, if you go back to the period of the elections preceding this one, young people in Zimbabwe have been on the forefront. If you look at all the protests that have been there,
but was their voice given credence in that political space?
Well, not at all. I think one of the things that, because I'm part of the Youth League of the ruling party, we've been having a lot of bilaterals with the ZANU-PF youth because of the liberation movement. And one of the things that we've consistently raised with them, I mean, if you look at even the profile of the youth movement or their definition of the youth, is something that is probably different from our own definition. But I think our discussions have been fruitful to say that, how do we make sure? I mean, young people, by the way, outside of playing the role in politics, all of us have a generational mission across the continent, across the world. We want to see the lives of young people changing for the better. Indeed, Zimbabwean youth are educated, but that education does not translate to anything economically. They're not getting jobs, they're not having a thriving, economic situation that will encourage business and so on. So many of them come into our country. And by the way, some of them in our country do get involved, in various, setups that seek to create a better political environment in South Africa. So the encouragement that we've actually given to them is that probably the time is now. We've now witnessed a violence-free election. Maybe it's time that they also contribute, as educated as they are, to the betterment of Zimbabwe and its people.
Yesterday we spoke to a youth representative also in Zimbabwe. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was right after former President Robert Mugabe's speech. And he said, well, those were just utterances from an old man whose time has expired. And what they are seeking now is for change. And of course, those reforms and policies. Talk to us about these reforms and policies that should be at the forefront of any leader that's going to take these elections, Sifiso.
Well, as I said, the big issue is economic emancipation for young people.
Yes, absolutely.
What we call economic freedom. What is important is that, and there's one thing that we from South Africa would never discredit from a Zimbabwean point of view, is the whole issue of the land reform, which has led to the near collapse of the economy of Zimbabwe due to sanctions and so on and so on. In South Africa, that's another big issue that we're having, the issue of land reform, expropriation of land without compensation. Now, what is important and what is encouraging, if we listen to all the political players there, is that as much as indeed they will encourage, foreign direct investment, the land will still belong to the Zimbabwean people. Whether the land tenure would be 99 years or whatever it is, but the land will still belong to the people of Zimbabwe. What is important is that these young people who are studying all over, the world, in South Africa, let them come back and use their skills to work the land and make sure that the land of Zimbabwe actually delivers economic prosperity. This is the change that I think must happen in Zimbabwe going forward.
And Sifiso, I mean, looking at the current challenges that are faced by the youth, both in Zimbabwe and South Africa, what comparisons can you draw between the two, and also in the way that we can and do deal with them currently?
Well, I think you're right. The challenges are the same. Young people in South Africa, in their millions, they are unemployed. In fact, we now have a situation of unemployed graduates, young people who now stand in street lights, actually holding placards and saying that I've got a degree, in engineering or this, but I cannot get a job. But I think one thing that we're saying, and we've been engaging government on, is to say that the solutions to youth unemployment and youth challenges must be derived from the youth themselves.
Absolutely.
You cannot have a bunch of old people seated in a corner
deciding
somewhere
for us what
and
is
saying
good
this
for us.
is what must happen. And I think we've started doing that. From the NYDA point of view, for instance, we've called for the scrapping of experience as an entrance requirement for entry-level jobs.
We remain get experience when you're coming out of varsity.
You can't be 21 years old and you went through a university system and you are told that you need experience. But for instance, a receptionist is somebody who just answers a call, transfer it to the next office. Why do you need 5 years experience for that? So those are the things that actually we started to engage. But I think quite importantly, we need to create an environment of entrepreneurship, particularly for young people of Zimbabwe. And what we have actually been saying, there's a national lekgotla of the ruling party that is currently sitting,
in Pretoria,
and we've been participating there to say, one of the things that we need to do in terms of trade in the SADC region is to remove what we call trade barriers, things like the visa. We need to relax those particular, regulations that are there, but also ensuring that the SMMEs, particularly youth-owned SMMEs, should be able to also trade in the different countries and be able to contribute to job creation in those particular countries. But also the skills that come from Zimbabwe, from Botswana, that come into the country must be able to also translate into jobs. So that's a discussion that we're having, that we think as young people we can take all these countries forward into this prosperity.
And have you engaged? I hear that you said that you've been supporting the youth of Zimbabwe in terms of, electoral education. How did that go about? Does it seem that they are interested in taking part in the elections, or it's just a thing that, oh, no, I need to go and vote and I'll just go and vote because I have to, or they have an actually vested interest to take those policies further? Well,
I think the current landscape, as I said, in the beginning, people were a bit unsettled. Will there be violence? Will there not be violence? Will be people arrested and so on and so on? And I think what we've just seen and what we've witnessing throughout the day,
it's a breakthrough,
is something that will say in future. By the way, the elections don't stop here today. There will still be elections into local government. There will still be elections, parliamentary elections. And I think young people will then look at it and say, probably let's start getting involved. But more importantly, and this is a point I raised earlier, young people must not just be reduced to voting fodder. People that just must be taken out of the house.
Yeah.
Young people must be part of the governance. They must be part of the decision makers. We cannot take decisions and say, 10 years from now, this is what must happen. You have a 78-year-old that says, in 2030, this was must happen. By 2030, some of them will be dead. We need young people that will be able to come today and say, this is the future that we want. This is a Zimbabwe that we want 30 years from now. And we must be able to form part of it and deliver that particular Zimbabwe that we want.
And you know, Sifiso, what you're saying, you need to have a voice to put those views across. Do you think youth, and I'm not just talking about Zimbabwe now, do you think youth have a particular strong voice when it comes to politics in the African continent?
Well, in our country, I think the youth has played a very crucial role.
Yeah.
Just recently, we've had what was called the Fees Must Fall movement and so on. So, I mean, in South Africa, you go back, young people has been at the center.
1976, yeah.
We have always been at the center of the issues. But I think one of the things that we need to do, the more, you know, the African continent becomes democratic, you know, we start moving away from an autocratic or dictatorship type of leadership. And when we start moving away from people who stay in presidency for unlimited terms. I think Africa, if you look at the AU, has started to encourage, you know, 2 terms per presidents, 10 years per presidents. But in some countries, you see it lapses. There's referendums that are taken. But I think if we can stick to the 2 terms per presidents, you will have a high rollover, you know, of presidents. And in that way, you will have a more injection of young people into the body politics of the continent. And I think for us, as a country, as a leading country in the continent, we must make sure that the continent becomes fully democratic from north to south in order to ensure that we have a high turnover of leaders. And in that way, young people will start getting involved more actively.
Sifiso, your parting notes, I mean, it's almost 7 o'clock. I'm just looking at the time. It's now 5:30. It's just 20 to 5. 20 to 6, I mean, and the polling stations are closing at 7 o'clock. What do you think what do you expect in the aftermath of the elections? Do you think that everybody's going to accept the outcome? And maybe let's hear your message to Zimbabweans in general today.
Well, firstly, I want to say the Zimbabweans must be very proud. Today, to borrow our words, is indeed a new dawn, you know, for the people of Zimbabwe. And I think that all the parties have committed themselves to say they will accept, you know, the outcomes. And if you look at how the campaigning has gone, I think that is encouraging. And if probably an exchange of power were to happen, I think one thing that we would want to see is a smooth transfer of power. And I think South Africa has been a beacon, you know, in terms of, I mean, we've had 5 democratic elections. In some provinces, we've seen the ruling party, you know, being replaced by the opposition. There was a smooth transfer of power. We've seen it in the metro. So I think one of the things that we want to see happen in Zimbabwe is that let there be a smooth transfer, if needs be. If the ruling party wins, I think all the people of Zimbabwe, the opposition, let's accept the democratic will of the people and let's take Zimbabwe to prosperity. So that everybody else who's not in Zimbabwe today must have confidence to go back to a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous Zimbabwe. And that's a message that we really want to send out to all Zimbabweans.
Sifiso, thank you so much for your time, sir. That is Mr. Sifiso Mtsweni from the NYDA, and he was giving us a youthful South African perspective of the Zimbabwean elections. Let's take a quick ad break. More news after the break.